Chapter 1. Lieutenant Aiden Blake stared out through the shattered windows of the command bunker, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the horizon. The landscape was a grim canvas of scorched earth, broken machinery, and smoke rising into the heavy air. Kal'thar was dying, and with it, humanity's last hope of survival. The planet had been a strategic outpost, a place where Earth's forces were supposed to make their final stand. But now it was all but a graveyard. Aiden's hands rested on the cold metal surface of the command table, his fingers tapping softly as he thought. The Xal'Thun Coalition's fleet loomed above, like a shadow that stretched across the sky. They were coming. They had already broken through the outer defenses. What was left of humanity's forces could barely be counted on two hands. But he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "Sir." Captain Lara Fisher's voice cut through his thoughts. She was a few steps behind him, but Aiden didn't need to look to know the expression on her face. It was the same look he'd seen on so many faces before. A mixture of disbelief and fear, tempered with the steely resolve of soldiers who knew that defeat was imminent, yet still refused to admit it. He turned to face her. "What is it, Captain?" "We've lost contact with the 7th and 9th Battalions. They're on. There's nothing left to hold the line." Aiden's gaze flicked back to the window. The alien forces were like an unstoppable tide, swelling on the horizon, ready to wash over the last remnants of humanity. But he didn't flinch. "We're not dead yet." Lara's lips tightened, her shoulders square. "What's the plan, sir?" Aiden exhaled slowly, his mind already racing. His plan wasn't conventional, it wasn't even tactical in the traditional sense. But it was their only chance. "We turn the battlefield against them," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "We use what we have. Everything." Lara stared at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we make weapons out of everything around us. We use the wreckage, the alien tech, the environment. They're too arrogant to think we're capable of adapting. But they're wrong. I'm going to show them that anything can be a weapon when used by the right hands." Aiden stepped forward, drawing a makeshift map on the cracked table. He traced the position of the remaining human forces, their dwindling supply lines, the scattered remnants of destroyed ships, and the alien advances. It wasn't much, just a few outposts and a dozen or so soldiers. "We'll lure them into the open. Set traps where they won't expect it. We'll use their own technology against them." He glanced up at Lara, his expression unyielding. "We can't win this with firepower. We win with ingenuity." Lara took a step closer, studying the map with sharp eyes. "That's insane, sir. If we fail, we're wiped out. No questions. No coming back." "I know. But if we don't fight now, we don't fight at all." Aiden's voice was low, his words heavy. "Get the others. We'll need every hand." The soldiers gathered quickly, their faces a mix of uncertainty and resolve. They had lost so much already. This wasn't supposed to be their fate. Aiden could see the questions in their eyes, the unspoken doubts they harbored. But there was no time for doubt now. "Listen up," Aiden said, addressing the group. "We don't have much, but we have our resourcefulness. We'll use what's left of the wreckage. Take everything. Weapons, fuel, broken parts, alien tech, scrap metal, whatever you can find. We'll convert all." Lieutenant Jason Miller, one of the senior officers, stepped forward, his face smeared with dirt. "You're asking us to fight with garbage, sir?" Aiden met his gaze. "Garbage? No. Weapons. Think about it, Miller. What does the enemy rely on? Technology. They think we're weak because we don't have the same firepower. But we have something they don't: creativity. Resourcefulness. If we can turn their tech into something they don't understand, we gain an edge. The Xal'Thun think they're untouchable. Let's prove them wrong." Jason hesitated, then nodded. He turned to the other soldiers, giving them a curt nod. They all followed suit, though none seemed particularly convinced. Still, they trusted Aiden. If he said it was their last chance, they'd follow him into hell itself. Aiden's heart hammered in his chest as he watched them disperse. He was asking a lot of them, more than he should have. They were already weary, already broken. But there was no choice now. This was it. The fight for survival was no longer about strength. It was about outsmarting the enemy, taking the tools they had and flipping them on their head. He spent the next few hours overseeing the operation. His mind worked like a machine, thinking through every possibility, every contingency. They scavenged wreckage from fallen ships, found alien tech scattered across the battlefield, and collected anything that could be of use. Even the barren, rocky landscape held potential. One of the soldiers, Private Luis Delgado, had found a small cache of chemicals that could be used as improvised explosives. Another group was hacking into a destroyed Xal'Thun war machine to see if they could reverse engineer any useful weapons. "Sir," Lara's voice broke through his concentration. "We got something interesting. One of the alien drones, they've been using them for reconnaissance. We think we can hack it." Aiden's eyes lit up. "What's the catch?" "They've got an anti-tamper system. We'll need a few hours to break through it." Aiden nodded. "Do what you have to. It's worth the risk." He turned back to his work. The plan was coming together. It wasn't pretty, but it was their only shot. They had no time to waste. The Xal'Thun would be on them soon. As the final preparations were made, Aiden allowed himself a moment of reflection. The soldiers were doing everything they could. He could see it in their eyes, the fatigue, the fear, the resolve. They were willing to follow him, even into the abyss. He had to make sure it wasn't in vain. "Sir." Lara's voice was softer now, almost hesitant. She stood by the door, watching him carefully. "What is it, Captain?" She hesitated, then said, "Just be careful. We don't have another plan if this one fails." Aiden met her gaze, his expression firm. "We'll make it work. We have to." With that, he turned his attention back to the makeshift map. Time was running out, but humanity wasn't finished yet. Not if he had anything to say about it. The wind outside howled as if to mock them, but Aiden was undeterred. The fight for Kal'thar wasn't over. Not while he was still standing. Chapter 2: The rumble of the approaching alien forces reverberated through the cracked walls of the bunker. The sound wasn't just from the ground. It was the deep hum of an invasion, an unstoppable march of technology, of weapons far beyond what humanity had ever dreamed. Aiden Blake could feel it in his bones, the cold dread that would come with being outnumbered, outgunned. But still, he wasn't backing down. Outside the bunker, the sky darkened. The Xal'Thun fleet was descending, their enormous warships casting monstrous shadows across the desolate landscape. Aiden could see the reflection of their ships in the broken windows. It was like staring into the abyss. "We don't have long, sir," Lara Fisher said, her voice tense. She stood beside him, scanning the horizon. "They're moving faster than we anticipated. They're almost on top of us." Aiden exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had a plan, but in these moments, plans often became nothing more than good intentions. He knew they couldn't win with sheer firepower. Their best chance was misdirection, traps, and above all, timing. "How are we on the traps?" he asked, turning to her. Lara gave a tight nod. "The first phase is set. Mines are in position, the makeshift explosive devices are rigged, and the alien tech we scavenged. Ready to go?" Aiden interrupted. "As ready as we'll be," she replied, the corner of her lips twitching in what could have been a smile, or perhaps a grimace. "If they don't walk straight into them, we'll have to improvise." Aiden nodded. "We'll make them walk into them. Trust me." He turned back to the command table, checking the schematics again. It wasn't much of a defense. Just a series of poorly constructed barriers made from scrap, a few high-powered explosives hidden in strategic positions, and the repurposed Xal'Thun tech. They had a hope that the aliens would underestimate them, that they'd treat them as weak as they always had. The ground shook again, louder this time. The Xal'Thun were closing in. Aiden stood tall, his eyes steady. He wasn't just the leader of the last remaining human forces on Kal'thar. He was the architect of their survival. Every soldier here was depending on him to make the impossible happen. "Time to get into position," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. "All teams, move out." The humans scattered, each soldier moving with precision, preparing for the battle they knew would likely be their last. Aiden watched them go, each of them carrying the weight of uncertainty with them. They were scared. Hell, he was scared. But fear wasn't a luxury they could afford. The Xal'Thun forces appeared on the horizon now, a massive column of armored soldiers and towering war machines. The ground trembled as they moved. It was like watching a nightmare take shape, but Aiden's mind was clear. There was no room for panic now. "Everything's set, sir," came the voice of Sergeant Ethan Ross, one of the soldiers working on setting the explosives. He crouched behind a pile of rubble, his weapon at the ready. "We're in position." "Good," Aiden replied, nodding. "Wait for my signal." The first Xal'Thun soldier appeared at the edge of their sight line, a hulking, armored beast of a creature, with piercing red eyes and a weapon that could level entire buildings. It didn't hesitate. It marched forward, its heavy boots crushing everything in its path. Behind it, the rest of the alien army followed suit. Aiden's pulse quickened, but his resolve remained firm. The timing had to be perfect. The mines were set to trigger automatically, but he had to ensure that the aliens wouldn't get past the first line of defenses. He watched as they closed the distance, each step drawing them closer to the trap. Then, just as the first wave reached the hidden mines, Aiden gave the signal. "Now," he shouted. The ground erupted in explosions. Alien soldiers were sent flying, their advanced armor barely protecting them from the sheer force of the blast. A few fell, their bodies twisted and broken from the impact. The rest staggered back, confused, dazed. It was the chaos they needed, the opening they were waiting for. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Get them into the second phase." Aiden shouted. "We can't let them regroup." The second wave of defenses triggered. They had re-engineered Xal'Thun drones into deadly traps. The repurposed alien technology now worked against them. Drones that once flew silently above their heads were now reprogrammed to seek out the alien forces, releasing bursts of high-voltage energy in targeted areas. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was effective. The drones hummed through the air, darting between wreckage and debris, their metallic bodies gleaming in the dim light. As the first one approached a group of Xal'Thun soldiers, it released an electric pulse that sent them convulsing to the ground. The soldiers around them staggered, taking cover behind anything they could find. It wasn't the decimation Aiden had hoped for, but it disrupted the alien advance. Yet, as he watched them regroup, Aiden knew they wouldn't be disoriented for long. The Xal'Thun were a species of unmatched intellect and cold calculation. They'd adapt. They always did. "We've got a new problem," Lara said, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. "The war machines are advancing. We can't stop them with this. Not without heavier firepower." Aiden clenched his fists. He knew what that meant. Their improvised weapons were only going to get them so far, but they had to make it work. "We can't afford to fight them head-on. We need to use their arrogance against them. They think they're unstoppable. We'll show them otherwise." He looked around, his mind whirring. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery. Just the alien tech they had hacked, the landmines, and whatever they could throw together. Aiden keyed his communicator, calling out to the scattered teams. "Prepare Phase 3. It's all or nothing now." As the alien forces pressed on, their war machines leading the charge, Aiden's team moved quickly. They planted the final traps, a mix of chemical concoctions, repurposed energy weapons, and more alien tech. It wasn't pretty, but it had to be enough. When the war machines rolled into position, Aiden saw his chance. The machines were too large to move quickly, too cumbersome to adapt to the traps laid in front of them. The final phase of their strategy was designed to catch them off guard, to turn the Xal'Thun's own overconfidence into a weakness. As the first machine rolled over the minefield, Aiden shouted the final command. The ground beneath the war machine gave way, triggering a massive underground explosion. The Xal'Thun war machine rocked, its legs buckling, sparks flying from its exposed circuits. It crashed to the ground, taking out several of its own soldiers in the process. The air was filled with the sounds of chaos, explosions, alien shouts, and the hum of weapons discharging. But in the midst of it all, Aiden felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. "Phase 3's a success," Lara said, her voice crackling over the comms. "But this isn't over." Aiden didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the battlefield. The Xal'Thun were far from beaten, but they had been shaken. And for the first time, it felt like humanity had a chance. "We fight until the last," Aiden muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And for the first time in days, he believed it. The sun, barely visible through the thick clouds of smoke that hung over the battlefield, cast an eerie orange glow over Kal'thar. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as if the very air was heavy with the weight of the war. The ground still trembled from the last round of explosions. Aiden Blake stood in the command center, watching the flickering displays, his mind racing. The Xal'Thun had suffered, but the battle was far from won. Their war machines were still operational, and the alien soldiers, though rattled, were regaining their composure. This moment of respite was fleeting. They needed more. "Sir," came Lara's voice over the comms, breaking his train of thought. "The outer defenses are holding, but they're regrouping. We're running out of time." Aiden's eyes narrowed. Time had never been on their side, but now, it was a luxury they could no longer afford. He turned, his jaw set. "We can't stop them with conventional means. We need something bigger." Lara hesitated before speaking again, her voice quieter this time. "The captured Xal'Thun tech. We can reverse engineer some of it, but it's risky. If we fail, we lose everything." Aiden felt the weight of her words press on him. The stakes were high, higher than ever before. But they had no other choice. "Do it. We'll improvise if we have to. I'll take the lead on this one." Hours later, the hum of machinery filled the command bunker as Aiden, Lara, and a small team of engineers huddled over the alien technology they had scavenged from the battlefield. Broken pieces of Xal'Thun drones and malfunctioning energy weapons were spread across the table. The alien tech was advanced, far beyond anything humanity had ever created, but it wasn't perfect. There were flaws, vulnerabilities, things they could exploit. "This is insane," muttered Sergeant Miller, who had been tasked with helping reassemble the weaponry. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale from the exhaustion of the constant fighting. "We're hoping these pieces of junk will actually work against them." Aiden didn't flinch. He had seen worse odds before. He'd been in situations where failure was the only option. Yet somehow, he'd always managed to find a way. "We've got nothing left to lose, Miller. We either make this work, or we don't make it at all." Lara leaned over a console, her fingers moving rapidly as she interfaced with the Xal'Thun's power core. "If I can reroute this energy conduit, we might have a chance at creating a feedback loop that will overload their systems. It's not exactly elegant, but it could destabilize their war machines long enough for us to hit them where it hurts." "Fine," Aiden said, looking up. "Let's do it. But we need to act fast. I want those machines disabled, not just inconvenienced." Lara nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll need a few more minutes to finish. We're dealing with a quantum processor here. It's not a simple fix." Aiden turned toward the soldiers gathered in the bunker. "Get ready," he said, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. "Once Lara gives the word, we move. No hesitation." The next few minutes passed in tense silence, each soldier preparing mentally for the next phase of the fight. They were all exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, but they had come this far. The fire of determination still burned in their eyes. Aiden could see it in them all, the same unspoken resolve that had kept them going from the first day of this war. "Done," Lara said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We got a shot at this. It's not guaranteed, but it's our best option." Aiden nodded. "Then we move out. All teams fall in. We're taking the fight to them." The humans moved swiftly, slipping through the darkened remnants of Kal'thar's ruined cities, using the cover of crumbled buildings and the chaos of the battle to avoid detection. The alien forces had regrouped in a clearing ahead, their war machines lined up, their soldiers preparing for the next push. They weren't expecting another assault. Not yet. As they reached their position, Aiden looked back at his team. "Phase 1, take out the drones. Phase 2, disable the war machines. Phase 3, we move in with everything we've got." Lara was in the lead, guiding the soldiers toward the alien tech they needed to reach. "We'll use the energy feedback loop to scramble their targeting systems. Once we've done that, they'll be blind. It's a window, but it won't last long." Aiden checked his weapon one last time, his mind racing through the steps of the plan. They had only one shot at this. If they failed, they would be overrun in minutes. There was no room for error. The first wave of alien drones moved into view. They hovered silently, scanning the area for any sign of human activity. Aiden signaled to his team, and they spread out, taking cover in the rubble. The drones were vulnerable now, distracted by the chaos of the battlefield, their sensors focused on the movements of alien infantry. On my mark, Aiden whispered. 3, 2, 1. Lara activated the feedback loop. There was a sharp crackle of energy as the drones' targeting systems sputtered and died. The machines jerked, disoriented, their flight paths erratic. Some fell from the sky, crashing into the earth, their power systems sparking. The rest, confused and malfunctioning, hovered in place. Move! Aiden shouted. The humans surged forward, charging at the disabled drones with a fury born of desperation. The alien forces weren't far behind, but the drones were down, and the humans had the element of surprise. Aiden and his team reached the war machines. They planted their explosives, tiny devices they had fashioned from the wreckage of previous battles. These were not sophisticated weapons, but in this moment, that didn't matter. They only needed to buy enough time. Ready, Lara called over the comms. Then let's make them regret coming here, Aiden said, activating the detonators. The explosions were deafening, sending shock waves through the battlefield. The war machines shuddered, their exterior armor buckling under the force. Sparks flew as the circuits inside began to fry. The machines screeched, their powerful engines sputtering. But it wasn't enough. The war machines were resilient, built to withstand far worse than this. They wouldn't fall so easily. Damn it, Aiden muttered, gritting his teeth. We need more. Lara's voice crackled over the comms. We can overload their energy cores, but it will take longer. I'll need cover while I finish the rerouting. Aiden looked at his soldiers, and without another word, they formed a perimeter around Lara. They were down to their last options, no second chances. Do it, Aiden ordered. We've got your back. As Lara worked furiously at the alien tech, Aiden kept his eyes on the advancing Xal'Thun forces. The war machines were still standing, but they were damaged. Their advantage was slipping. They weren't invincible. Not anymore. Time seemed to stretch as Lara worked. Every second felt like an eternity. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes never left the battlefield. This was their last chance. Then, the moment arrived. Lara's voice came through the comms again, steady and sharp. It's done. Now, Aiden shouted. The feedback loop sent a final surge of energy into the war machines. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The hum of the battlefield, the thrum of weapons charging, all silent. Then the war machines faltered. The Xal'Thun soldiers paused, confused, as their weapons failed to target properly. The once formidable machines now staggered, their systems spiraling into chaos. The humans had done it. Aiden exhaled sharply. We have them on the ropes. Let's finish this. They were far from done, but this was the break they needed. Aiden felt the tide of battle shift, even if just a little. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small, fleeting moment of hope. The battlefield had descended into chaos. The dust of ruined buildings swirled in the air, blending with the acrid smoke that clung to the ruins of Kal'thar. Yet in the midst of the disarray, Aiden Blake felt a strange sense of clarity. The tide of the battle had shifted, but the outcome was still uncertain. The Xal'Thun had been rattled, but they were far from defeated. The human forces had a brief window to act, and it was closing fast. Aiden's boots crunched on the gravel as he strode toward the newly formed command center, which was little more than a few metal walls thrown together for cover. The sounds of skirmishes and distant gunfire echoed around him, a constant reminder of how precarious their position truly was. Lara Fisher was already inside, reviewing the data on a cracked display screen. Her face was drawn, weary from days of relentless fighting, but her sharp eyes never stopped scanning. Sir, she greeted him curtly. The war machines are still standing, but their targeting systems are fried. They're slower now, disoriented. Aiden nodded. That's progress, but not enough. We need to hit them hard. We've only got one shot left. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. I don't have to tell you that we're out of options, Aiden. The next move has to be decisive. We can't afford another counterattack. Aiden ran a hand through his disheveled hair. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating. The reality of the war had never been clearer. There was no second chance, no retreat. They either destroyed the Xal'Thun or were wiped out. I know, he said, his voice low but firm. We make this next strike count. We use their weakness. We've already crippled their machines, but if we can breach their command ship, we'll break their will. Lara's eyes narrowed, scanning the display. Their command ship is heavily guarded. We're looking at dozens of soldiers and maybe even more war machines. If we're wrong, we won't be. Aiden cut her off. We've got the element of surprise, and we have something they don't, ingenuity. We hit them where it hurts. The plan was set. Aiden's strategy was a gamble, but it was the only card they had left to play. They had one final push to make, a push to take down the Xal'Thun command ship and cripple their leadership. But the clock was ticking, and the pressure was immense. They had to move now, before the aliens adapted again. Aiden gathered his soldiers in the makeshift war room, their faces a mix of exhaustion and steely resolve. They were all still here, despite everything, despite the odds stacked against them. He admired their resilience, even though they all knew the stakes. We hit fast. We hit hard. Aiden began, his voice carrying over the room. The Xal'Thun command ship is where we make our stand. We'll use what we've learned about their tech and turn it against them. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're going blind, and we don't have the numbers. But we've got something they can't match, our ability to adapt, to outthink them. Sergeant Miller, still battered from the earlier battle, raised an eyebrow. And if we get pinned down, what's the backup plan? Aiden met his gaze, unwavering. There is no backup plan. This is it. We breach the ship, disable their command systems, and take down their leadership. If we fail, this planet falls. If we succeed, we force them to retreat. The room went silent. For a moment, the weight of Aiden's words settled over the soldiers. No one was naive about the risks. But this was the only option left. Captain Fisher stepped forward. We've already got the tech we need to hack into their systems. It's going to be a tight squeeze, but it's possible. Good. Aiden nodded. Everyone knows their role. We move out in 10. Stay sharp. We're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting to send a message. The march toward the Xal'Thun command ship was tense. Every footstep felt like an eternity as Aiden's team advanced cautiously, hugging the shadow of ruined buildings and the debris of fallen war machines. The smoke was thick, making visibility low, but worked to their advantage. The Xal'Thun didn't expect a direct assault. They were preparing for a more methodical siege. And that was their mistake. Aiden held up a hand to signal the team to stop. Ahead, the hulking form of the command ship loomed, its engines idling, its surface covered in massive armored plating. Alien soldiers patrolled the perimeter, and Aiden could feel the weight of their approach pressing against him. We breached through here, he said in a low voice, pointing to a vulnerable section of a ship's exterior. It's not much, but it's the only opening we have. Lara was already moving, her fingers working on the hacked alien comms device. Give me 30 seconds to disable their outer shields. We need a clean shot through. Aiden nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any movement. The tension was palpable, the silence almost suffocating. The last few hours have been a blur, preparation, planning, and the quiet knowledge that they might not come back. But there was no turning back now. The time had come. Lara's voice cut through the silence. Shield her down. Now. The explosion that followed was deafening. The sound echoed across the wasteland as the human forces broke into a sprint, charging the breach in the command ship's hull. The Xal'Thun soldiers, momentarily stunned, scrambled to react, but it was too late. Aiden and his team poured into the opening, their weapons raised, ready for anything. The interior of the command ship was a cold, metallic labyrinth of corridors, lit by dim, flickering lights. The smell of ozone and machinery filled the air, and the hum of alien technology reverberated through the walls. Split up, Aiden ordered. We need to find the command center and disable their control systems. As they moved through the ship, the sense of urgency heightened. Alien soldiers appeared at every turn, but the humans were quick and ruthless. The element of surprise worked in their favor. Every turn, every encounter was a carefully timed strike. The Xal'Thun, despite their advanced weapons, were caught off guard by the humans' adaptability. Aiden pushed forward, never looking back. Then, they reached the heart of the ship, the command center. The door stood before them, guarded by two massive Xal'Thun officers, their red eyes glowing in the dim light. They were more advanced, stronger than regular soldiers, but Aiden didn't hesitate. "On my mark," Aiden whispered. They rushed forward, catching the officers off guard. The fight was brutal, but quick. Within moments, the two Xal'Thun officers were down, their bodies crumpling to the floor. Aiden's team breached the command center, and Lara went to work, connecting their improvised hacking device to the central console. "Give me a minute," she said, her fingers flying over the interface. Aiden stood guard, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of reinforcement. It wouldn't be long before the Xal'Thun regrouped. They had to act fast. Lara's voice broke the silence. "I've got it. Systems are offline. We've taken down their command structure." Aiden took a deep breath. They'd done it. Against all odds, they had breached the command ship and disabled its core systems. The Xal'Thun were no longer in control. But as the reality of their victory began to sink in, Aiden knew this was only the first step. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, humanity had the upper hand. Chapter 5: The war had been won, but Aiden Blake could not bring himself to celebrate. As he stood on the edge of the battlefield, looking out at the smoldering wreckage of Kal'thar, the weight of their victory crushed him. The planet was a lifeless husk now, a testament to humanity's resilience and ingenuity, but it had come at a heavy price. The sound of distant explosions had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The Xal'Thun had retreated, their command ship crippled, their forces scattered. But that didn't bring Aiden peace. There were too many faces missing, too many soldiers who would never see another sunrise. And though the battle was over, the cost of that victory was not something Aiden could shake. "How long do you think it'll take to rebuild?" Lara Fisher's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood beside him, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Her uniform was torn, her eyes hollow from the days of constant fighting. But there was a flicker of something in her, something akin to relief, though it was buried beneath the layers of grief and fatigue. Aiden shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the ruined landscape. "We don't have the resources to rebuild. Not here. Not yet. But we'll rebuild. We always do." Lara sighed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I wish I could believe that. It feels like too much. Too many lives lost." Aiden's jaw tightened. He could hear her words, but it was hard to accept the truth of them. How could he ask his people to rebuild when the toll had been so high? So many dead, so many broken. And even now, with the Xal'Thun retreating, the scars of this war would last a lifetime. "We didn't have a choice," Aiden said quietly, almost to himself. "We had to fight. If we didn't, if we let them win—" "I know," Lara interrupted, her voice softening. "I know we had no choice, but sometimes I wonder if it was worth it." She paused, looking at the scattered remnants of the war around them, the broken bodies of fallen soldiers, the crumpled metal of alien war machines, the shattered earth where cities had once stood. Is anything worth this kind of sacrifice? Aiden couldn't answer. He didn't know, but there was no time to dwell on those questions. The war was over, but the aftermath had only just begun. They returned to the makeshift command center, where the remaining human soldiers had gathered. The room was a mix of exhaustion and grim determination. Everyone was waiting for their next orders, their next move. Some were tending to the wounded. Others were securing the area, making sure the Xal'Thun had truly left. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the weight of the victory was still settling on their shoulders. Aiden walked into the center, his footsteps slow but purposeful. He took a moment to look at the faces of the men and women who had followed him through this war. They were his family now, his responsibility. Each one had given something of themselves, and it was impossible to ignore the toll it had taken. He had led them to victory, but at what cost? "Listen up," Aiden said, his voice carrying through the room. "The Xal'Thun have been pushed back. We've won, but we're not done yet." Lara stood beside him, nodding. "There's still the matter of what comes next. We need to assess the damage, recover what we can, and regroup. We have a lot of work to do." Aiden looked around at the soldiers, some of whom were barely standing. "We don't have a choice. We can't just sit here and wait for the next attack. Kal'thar might be lost, but we'll rebuild. And we'll make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. This is our new beginning." One of the soldiers, Private Delgado, raised his hand. His face was drawn, tired, but there was a certain resolve in his eyes. "What about the civilians? There were civilians on this planet. We can't just leave them behind." Aiden's eyes flicked to the floor for a moment, the memory of those who had died still fresh in his mind. He hadn't forgotten the civilians, those families who had been caught in the crossfire. "We'll do what we can," he said, his voice heavy. "We'll get them to safety. We'll rebuild. But right now, we need to focus on securing what we have left." Lara placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "And what about the rest of the galaxy? The Xal'Thun aren't the only threat we'll face. This is just the beginning." Aiden met her gaze, his expression resolute. "The galaxy will have to wait. We've fought for survival, but we've also learned something. We learned that humanity can do the impossible. We can take on the strongest force in the galaxy and come out on top. And we'll be damned if we let anyone forget that." The hours stretched into days as the survivors of Kal'thar worked tirelessly to secure their position. The alien warships had been disabled, the remnants of the Xal'Thun forces scattered. But the victory felt hollow. They had won, but what did it mean? What was the cost? And could they really rebuild from the ashes of this war? Aiden stood by the edge of the command center late that night, staring out at the stars. The darkness of space felt like a distant void, a reminder of how fragile life was. The fight for survival was never over. It was a constant battle against enemies, against doubt, against fear. "You're not sleeping," Lara said, stepping up beside him. "You should rest." Aiden shook his head, his voice low. "I don't think I'll ever sleep again. Not until we've fixed this. Not until we've made sure it was worth it." She didn't respond right away. For a long moment, she just stood beside him, looking at the stars. "We're not perfect, Aiden. We never were. But we made it through, and that counts for something." He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It counts for everything." As the weeks passed, humanity began to pick up the pieces. The planet Kal'thar would never be the same, but the people who had fought for it would be. Aiden knew that the war wasn't over. It was just changing. The galaxy was full of new challenges, new threats. But humanity had proven that it was capable of rising above the impossible. And for the first time in a long while, Aiden allowed himself a quiet moment of hope. They had survived the storm. They had endured. And as long as humanity stood together, they would keep fighting, no matter what came next.